I would love to take questions from you all, either in the chat, as we go along and you think of them, or if you'll ask them and hold them for the end. So the talk will probably take about 15 or 20 minutes, and we'll have lots of time to ask any questions you might have at the end. We will record this presentation also, and it will go up to the YouTube channel for RSS if you'd like to watch this again in the future. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And if anyone, just by means of a thumbs up, can let me know that they can see my screen. I see thumbs up, so that's good to hear. So here we go. So welcome to my food and wine pairing presentation. Such a good theme for the holiday season right now. I'm guessing, since you're here, that enjoying food and wine together is something you very much enjoy, and so do I. And I'd love to share my enjoyment of this with you all. So a little outline of what I'll talk about in my slides. We'll spend a little bit talking about wine fundamentals and vocabulary. Those are some words that will come up when we start talking about wine styles and how those wines end up pairing with different types of food. I'll focus on talking about white wines in about 4 different categories, and the same for red wines. We'll also talk about wines that don't belong into either of those categories. And I'll always preface this whole conversation that if you choose to enjoy wine, always want to do that responsibly. We will make the slides available at the end of the talk as well. If you signed up via email for the class, we'll be able to send those to you. So if you are taking notes, don't feel pressured to get everything down. We'll be sure to get you the slides. So just a little bit about me. Well, where's all my wine knowledge come from? Well, I used to live in Oregon, and one of the premier wine regions in the world is Oregon's Willamette Valley. They are known as a place, I call it the Tale of Two Pinots, much like the novel A Tale of Two Cities. Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris are well-known Oregon wines. So I've probably visited somewhere between 50 and 60 wineries in the Oregon area. And just through the sakes of tastings and just talking to winemakers and just sort of being around wine a lot. That's how I've kind of gained my knowledge, and have some books too. So that's who I am and where my background goes. By no means do I call myself a sommelier or master of wine, but more just a casual person who enjoys wine. So we'll start with a couple of wine fundamentals. Wine is really grown everywhere in the world. Grapes are a very, very, very hardy plant, and they can actually take some pretty extreme conditions. I believe wine is made in all 50 of the 50 states. That includes Alaska and Hawaii, and other places that are typically you might think would be too cold or too warm to sustain grapes. But grapes can almost grow anywhere. However, some areas are much better known for their wines than others. Certainly France, Italy, United States, but also places like Germany, places like Australia, South America, South Africa, all places that make wine that we can easily find here in stores in the New York area. Wines are often named in one of two ways, and it often depends on where the wine is from. If a wine is made broadly from what might be called, at least in the wine world, the old world, those usually be places in Europe. So wines from France, from Italy, from Germany, from Austria, from Spain, tend to be named for the places in which they are grown. So names like Bordeaux, Burgundy, those kinds of things, those are names of places Um, and other places, what might broadly be called New World, which is almost anywhere other than Europe, wines are often named by the grapes from which they are made. Um, so it's an interesting thing if you're looking at a shelf of wine. Um, some wines you'll see the grapes names, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, for example. But if you were looking at a wine that was called Chablis, you might not necessarily know that that's also a Chardonnay. Um, so wine is made, it can be very complicated, but simply grapes are harvested at the end of the growing season, and they are basically squashed and fermented, um, and bottled and aged over time, and eventually produces wine. Wine is just a stage between grape juice and vinegar. So when wine is too young, it's grape juice, and when wine is too old, it becomes vinegar. So some wines can age better because of some of their characteristics, and we'll get into that in a moment. Last thing I want to talk about here is this word terroir, which is a French word, and it's a really important concept when it comes to wine. Terroir is the idea that wine should really reflect the character of the place that it comes from. So that wine that's made from the same grape doesn't taste the same, depends on where it's from. So for example, a Cabernet Sauvignon that comes from California will have a different character than one that comes from France. That idea is called terroir. Next slide here. So there's a lot of vocabulary terms that I'm going to talk a little bit about here. Some of these will come up when we talk about the wine styles. Again, we'll have the slides to share at the end. So don't feel the need to jot all of this down, but I'll go through these here now. A lot of these things apply to different wines, not all, but most. Acidity in wine is something that you can, if you are drinking something, it tastes like it prickles the sides of your mouth. Wine tends to be more acidic. The pH, as I say, is between 3 and 3.5. But acidity is something that gives a wine structure. The alcohol in a wine comes from the sugar that's been fermented from the grapes. Most wines will usually have between 12 and 15%. There are some that will have more, and there are some that will have less. It often depends on how much sugar is in the grapes themselves and how long they've been allowed to ferment. The body of the wine, again, if the wine is in your mouth, it has a perceptible weight there. So different wines may feel heavier when they're in your mouth, and others will not quite feel so heavy. That idea is called the body of a wine. So you might hear someone talk about a wine being very full body or medium bodied or light bodied. They're really talking about just how it feels when it's in their mouth. The term dry is a term that's, when it comes to wine, refers to how sweet it is. So wines that are called dry wines will not be as sweet as those that are not marked dry. You will mostly see dry on certain sparkling wines like champagne and certain white wines, particularly of the aromatic variety, which I will get into in a moment. So if someone's talking about a wine that's dry, you'll know it's not sweet. The family of the three next things, the nose, the palate, and the finish, is sort of the sequence that if someone were appreciating a wine would be how it goes. So I'll start with the nose. It's how a wine smells when it's in the glass and you bring your nose up to it. And after you put it in your mouth, palate is how that wine tastes in your mouth. What flavors does it evoke for you? And finally, when you swallow the wine, what does it taste like? How does it feel when you swallow it? So that sequence of tasting wine, the nose, then the palate, and then the finish. And then finally, tannins are something that occurs naturally in grapes, even the grapes that you buy at the grocery store just to eat. Um, it's sort of the sensation that there's a rough feeling on the sides of your mouth when you are either eating those grapes or when you are drinking that wine. Some wines will have more tannins than others, and it goes based on how much tannin is in the grapes that the wine is made from. So if someone is saying a wine is very tannic, that would mean that it's going to have a lot of that rough feeling on the sides of your mouth versus a wine that is not tannic. It won't generally do that. Tannins are very most commonly seen in red wines um, and less so in white wines. You might be interested to know um, that exposure to the tannins is what gives wine either a white wine or a red wine color. The longer the grape skins are exposed to the juice, the more color the wine gets, and thus becomes a red wine. So you might be surprised to know that even, common red wines like Merlot or Cabernet start as white wines, but they turn red after they've been exposed to the grape skins for a longer period of time. All right, so this presentation is going to go into wine types. And rather than thinking of wines as a whole bunch of individual things that can be very difficult to keep track of when you walk into a wine store and are looking for something to go with your dinner, it's easier to think of wines in larger families, which many wines can belong to. So a lot of the traits that I just mentioned, their presence or their absence will define a wine's style. And as I said before, there are 4 main families of white wines and 4 main families of red wines that we'll talk about. And you'll kind of see how they're different from or even similar to each other. Although I will caution, and this can be tricky when you're in the store or looking at a wine list at a restaurant, some grapes can make wines of more than one type. So that would mean that some Merlots or some Cabernets could make the mild red, but others will make the powerful red. How do you know the difference? That comes a little more from experience. But there may be things on the bottle that you can see that would help you determine what style it might be. Similarly, a single wine might have traits of more than one of the families too. So it could be both an earthy and an aromatic white, for example. So when you put wine and food together, it's really going to do one of 2 things. The first is that the wine will complement the flavors and the textures in your food, so we'll bring those aspects out, or the wine will contrast with the flavors in your food and add another element to your meal. Both of those can work when it comes to pairing wine with different foods. And I'll maybe draw some attention to those examples as we get into the wine styles. So without further ado, I'll come to the most important slide in this whole talk, which is this one. I often get asked, hey, Audrey, what is the best wine? This is always my answer. The best wine is the wine that you enjoy. It's not the wine that I think is the best. It's not the wine that Wine Spectator thinks is best. It's not the wine that the New York Times wine column thinks is best. It's the one that you think is best. Because no one knows your unique palate and your unique sense of taste like you do. So always remember, the best wine is the wine you enjoy. All right, so we'll start with the white wine types, and there are 4 of them. I've got a slide for each one, but broadly, white wines can be categorized as fresh, earthy, aromatic, or full. And I will go into more details of each one. And again, don't feel the need to hurriedly write down these. We'll get the slides to you. So first, we'll start with the fresh whites. Um, so fresh white wines would broadly be those that have a light body, maybe are crisp, might describe them as refreshing. They'll have a mild flavor and they won't have any oak. Now, many wines are aged in oak barrels. And one of the things that can give wine character is by where it was aged. So wines in this family are aged in containers that don't impart the character of oak to them. So if you think of these wines as like when it's 90 degrees and humid on a July day in New York City, these are the wines that you'll want when it's really hot outside because they'll have that refreshing character with that high acidity and light body. So I've given some examples of wines that would be like that. Muscadet from France, Bordeaux Blanc, which is usually a blend of Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon, the grape Chenin Blanc, which makes Rouvray, and the grape Pinot Blanc as well, will all make wines like this. So if you're in a store, you're looking for a wine like this, those are some things you might find. Wines like this tend to be very easily overpowered by a lot of different foods because they will be more flavorful than this. So you have to be very careful in terms of what you pair with it. So you'll notice that the food pairing ideas I've suggested here generally tend not to be overwhelming foods. Most soft cheeses are pretty mild in flavor. Whitefish, different kinds, won't have a lot of flavor by itself. So these wines can complement them very, very well. This is also a good choice with cold salads. Again, kind of evoking that sort of summertime appeal of a wine like this. So those are the fresh whites. The next group is the earthy whites. I'll direct your attention to the Pinot Gris grapes on the right there. Notice how they are very, very blue and purple. But if you have a Pinot Gris wine, you'll know it's a white wine. So the color owes to the fact that those grape skins don't touch the juice for very long. So this wine will have more body, have more weight in your mouth compared to the fresh whites that we were just talking about. If I had to choose one word to describe these wines, and it might even be a made up word, you'll have to confirm that for me, is the word minerally. These kinds of wines, tend to have a lot of character that suggests, that it's of the earth, so that's why I use that word minerally. Not to say that they taste like dirt, rocks, but they have a very distinct palate, I will say. And again, these wines generally don't have the influence of a lot of oak in the aging process. So a few wines in this category, certainly the Pinot Gris that I mentioned, and Chardonnays in many types can be like this too. But there are other examples. And perhaps not surprisingly, with that emphasis on those earthy kinds of ideas, that wines like this tend to do well with foods that evoke the same flavors. So thus the mushroom and potato dish suggestions. These wines pair very well with those types of foods. And many sheep's milk cheeses also have these similarly kind of earthy character to them, and can really make these wines stand out. So those are the earthy whites. The next category is the aromatic white. These wines span quite a range. They have a lot in common with the the fresh whites that we were talking about earlier in terms of their light body and crispness. But the thing that makes these wines so different, and I see it's not on the slide, is their the nose literally jumps out of the glass. Like you open the bottle and you can smell it immediately. um, and when it's in the glass, it gets even stronger, and thus the name. Um, these wines are not shy, um, and as a result of those flavor profiles, they have so much to say on the nose and on the palate. Um, they need very flavorful food to complement them. Um, Examples of wines like this, Riesling, Viognier, Gewürztraminer, Albarino, and Grüner Veltliner are all grape varietals um, that can make aromatic whites. This is my personal favorite choice of white wines of the four. Um, these wines pair very well with food that you wonder what in the world pairs with this. So imagine dishes with lots of flavors, your typical Thai food or your Indian food, or foods that really, just um, have a lot to say just in the flavors that are in those dishes. These wines, because they also have so many flavors, can stand up to those kinds of things. The other things, many times, those are also dishes that are very spicy. And because, excuse me, because these wines sometimes have a little bit of sweetness to them that might be called off dry, they actually make a nice contrasting pairing there with something spicy and something a little bit sweet. Um, so I also like this wine because the flavor profile of a typical holiday dinner tends to have a lot of things going on. So these wines can do well if you have a big spread like you might have had for Thanksgiving a couple of weeks ago, or you might be having sometimes this month for a holiday get together. Um, so aromatic whites. The last group for the white wines is the full white wines. So these are the ones that will have the heaviest weight, the fullest body in your mouth, but especially will have the flavor of oak on them. So that they were aged in those oak barrels. And so when you open it there and taste it, you'll have a lot of like that butterscotch, caramels, those sorts of flavors might be evoked. That's what the oak barrels are doing to that wine. But they have such a different character than those that didn't have that oak exposure. So almost every full white wine is going to be aged in an oak barrel. So that's why I say many Chardonnays are like this, especially those from California, but not all. And many of the more robust Sauvignon Blancs will be like this too. But notice that I mentioned those grapes in the fresh wines, the earthy wines. So this can be tricky if you're in the store. You'll definitely want to look at the bottle, talk to the salespeople in the wine store. If they have a sense of an idea, especially if you're looking for a certain kind of wine, whether it would or would not fit those profiles. Sometimes the labels will tell you, but sometimes the labels tell you nothing. So a wine like this needs something a lot more substantial to pair with it than the foods we usually have been talking about. So aged cheeses tend to go well. Cream sauces tend to do well with a wine like this. A richer shellfish like lobster and pork can be good pairings for a wine like this. I noticed I didn't say cheese fondue. It's gonna be a good pairing too. All right, so we'll jump to the red wines. And again, there are 4 broad categories for the red wines. And they are mild, fruity, spicy and powerful. So without further ado, the mild reds. Um, and you'll notice some similarities between the themes from the whites and the themes from the reds. Um, the mild reds, again, are going to have a lighter body. They're not going to have a lot of tannin, despite the fact that they are red. So that means they'll be red from the exposure to the grapes, but that resulting wine doesn't impart those tannins to the palate when you drink it. Their flavors tend to be more subtle, and broadly, these wines might be called gentle. So if you meet someone that says, "Oh, I can't drink red wine," chances are they probably have more red wines in the other categories that probably were a stronger reaction on their palate. These are the most approachable red wines. Grapes that make wines like this, lots of Merlots tend to be in this mild category. Grapes from Italy made from Sangiovese, such as Chianti, can make wines like this. And wines made from the Grenache grape also tend to be mild. So much like the foods we talked about earlier, that you don't want to overwhelm the wine. Again, we don't want to overwhelm these wines either. So you'll see a lot of more straightforward foods here, milder cheeses, dinners like baked chicken, grilled vegetables. These work well with these reds because anything bigger might overpower them. The next group would be what I would call fruity reds. So these, unlike the first group, they will generally have the character of fruit coming out, not necessarily grape, but other common fruits like berries or currant. It smells like it was made from fruit. So that's the most noticeable thing from these. Probably the signature grape here is the Pinot Noir, which is the one illustrated. Tends to have a very fruit-forward character. These wines are almost never, aged or never blended with anything, because to do so would overwhelm their unique fruity character. So it's rare to see wines like Pinot Noir or Zinfandel or Primitivo blended with anything, because they tend to be so distinctly fruity on their own. Gamay is another example. That's the wine that's made from Beaujolais. So if any of you enjoyed the Beaujolais Nouveau that came out right before Thanksgiving, that was the grape it's made from. These wines too kind of go well with more straightforward food. Barbecue foods tend to go very well here. So it's the suggestion of hamburgers or other things you might cook on the grill tend to go very well here. This is another group of wines that does well for holiday dinners. Again, because they tend to have more flavor, enough flavor to stand up, but not get overwhelmed by any of the foods that you might be enjoying in a typical holiday meal. Then we have the spicy reds. So these wines tend to be a little bit more tannic. They will have a bit of that prickly sensation from the acidity in your mouth. And I think there's a character to these wines that once you've tried one, you'll understand why I call it a spicy red. So a lot of wines from Italy kind of come into this category from the Piedmont region. Dolcetto and Barbera are wines from that area. And perhaps for that reason, that's why I have such a strong pairing suggestion for dishes made from tomato sauce. Again, because of their acidity, things like pizza tend to go very well with wines like this. They are not as full bodied as the next group, and they'll still have some fruity character to them. But these, I think they are such a unique category on their own that if you're familiar with red wines, but you haven't tried one of these, you'll understand how they're different from other reds. This is the hardest one for me to put into words because they're so distinct from other things. Finally, we have the powerful reds. So if you imagine those big California wineries or those big, elite Bordeaux from the classified Gros Chateau, this is what we're talking about. So these are the wines that can age for 20 years and still be great. They'll have the fullest body, most tannins, very concentrated flavors. And that's why I use the word big in quotation marks. Almost all wine stores can identify their big wines easily. So as I mentioned, the Bordeaux and California wines, but other wines around the world can be made like this too. Again, from Piedmont, we have the Barolo and Barbaresco wines. From there, those are made from Nebbiolo, I believe. But these wines need food that can hold up to them. So that's why I'm listing some of the biggest foods that you can imagine: steaks, lasagna, barbecued meat, the aged cheeses, even blue cheese. These are wines that need very flavorful food, very hearty food, really, to combine with them. So those are the 4 red categories: mild, fruity, spicy, and powerful. So you might be wondering, Audrey, you forgot about a couple of wines, maybe even wines you enjoy. So I didn't forget you. We have some wines I didn't talk about. I didn't talk about rosé wines. I love rosé wines, even during the winter. Rosés are, in a way, they're a bit of a middle stage between white wine and red wine. They've just been allowed a little more skin contact with the grapes that makes them a rosé. So they will have many of the characteristics of a white wine of a similar style, but they might have a few characteristics of a related red wine style. Rosés are broadly in 2 categories. Far more common are the dry rosés. Typically, what you'll see in your wine stores, but rosés also are the blush wines, i.e. white Zinfandel, for example. So rosé wines kind of defy the style categories because they're really some of both. They're hard to categorize otherwise. The same is true for sparkling wines like champagne or prosecco. Many times those can be white or rosé, or even there are some red sparkling wines too. These again are kind of in a category of their own, and often tend to be characterized a little bit more on how sweet they are, and how much age they've had, and sometimes maybe how much body they have. But again, they defy categorization by what we were just talking about. So finally, there's also the dessert family of wines. So again, not really applying to those categories. Good examples would be the noble rot type dessert wines like Sauterne, or the fortified style wines like Porto would belong to this category. Again, the emphasis on the sweetness, either from the concentrated grape juice from, say, noble rot or ice wine styles, or deliberately stopping the fermentation of wine as it's done in port, makes these wines sweet, and therefore in their own category. Deep breath. So I know I have covered a lot in the last 20, 30 minutes here. So what I would love to do is break out of my screen share here and open up to any questions that anyone might have from here. So thank you all for your attention. I'm very interested in any questions you might have. So you can raise your hand or put them in the chat.
Or just unmute yourself if you have a question.
Okay, thank you, Margie.
Must have given them exactly what they need.
Yeah,
Sorry.
don't be shy. Don't be shy. There are no silly questions.
My question is less, Audrey, about wine itself than the way this wine are sold. Like, why is it in New York that you have to go to a separate store, where in California you can buy wine in gas stations, you can buy liquor in gas stations? Not that that's a good thing, but you know, it's just so deregulated. Is it a...
Yeah, it has everything to do with the Liquor Control Commission in each state. So, and even some counties, that they can, institute rules basically saying these are the businesses that are allowed to sell alcoholic beverages, and these are the ones that are not. So in the West Coast states and California in particular, you can get wine in grocery stores, literally right next to the food that you're buying to make dinner with in the next aisle. But New York is a lot more strict. And I think it's based on the alcohol percentage of where it can be bought. So I believe beer can be purchased in some stores that have the license to sell it. But specifically wine and spirits need to be purchased in specific stores, which is the rule here in New York. I think it is different across the river in New Jersey, but don't quote me on that. But does that answer your question? Sorry if I don't know your name.
Yeah, it does. It's just, walking into a Trader Joe's in Manhattan as opposed to a Trader Joe's in San Francisco. It's like, where's the wine? Where's the alcohol? And they're like looking at me like I'm crazy.
Okay, no, it's a good question though. So thank you. Didn't know your name, but I'm glad you're here.
Susan.
Oh, Susan, nice to have you. All right. I do see a question from the chat here. Liz asked, what accounts for the wide range of prices for champagne? It's a great question. So champagne is made in a variety of styles, but probably the number one factor that determines how expensive champagne is whether it's made from grapes from a single year or a vintage champagne, or wine that's made from grapes from multiple years, which would be called a non-vintage or NV champagne. So if you don't care what year your grapes came from to make the champagne that you're drinking, it's going to be a lot less money than a vintage champagne. The other factor that will make the champagne more expensive is who made it and how old it is. So the older a wine is, the more expensive it's going to be. And a winemaker like Dom Perignon is going to command a price that's very different than maybe a champagne chateau that you've not heard of before.
And it's also interesting, Audrey, I think your comment about, a good wine is the wine you like. Costco has its own label, Prosecco, because you can't call anything champagne unless it's made in the Champagne region. But
That's right.
Costco's Prosecco is one of the best Proseccos out there, and it's $7.99 a bottle. So
right. Price is not a determinant of how much you will enjoy a wine or even its quality sometimes. So that's an important point. Judy asked a question in the chat. It says, I have noticed more and more boxed wines. Any thoughts about these versus bottled? So that's a good point. So boxed wine is a method of being able to store wine that prevents it from being exposed too much to air. So when wine is exposed to air, that's what accelerates its aging process. So if you open a bottle of wine, and maybe you had a glass with dinner, and then you put the cork back on, and then you had it tomorrow, you probably noticed it tasted a little bit different. Or if you open the bottle, say today, and then you forgot about it until Monday, you might notice it's very different. The reason that that's important is those bottles aren't airtight. So they will accelerate the aging process literally from the moment they're opened. However, boxed wines are in such a way that they're in vacuum bags, basically, that air can't get at. Therefore, they don't age as quickly. So you can have a boxed wine that's been opened for a month and it tastes the same as it did on day one as it does on day 30. So is boxed wine inherently bad? No, not necessarily. But usually because it's in such a large container, usually less expensive wines tend to be packaged that way. They can be good for large parties or big events, or even for wines that a restaurant wants to feature as a house wine. So Judy, I hope that answers your question. Again, are there any other questions that anyone has? And I'll wait a moment, but I do have something I wanted to share here right at the end. So you may be curious what inspired how I structured today's talk, in terms of talking about wines and big families. And it actually comes from a book that I can suggest if you're interested in a lot more details about kind of wine and thinking of wine like this. So I'll hold it up to the camera here. I can spotlight my video again so you can see it. This is a book called Wine Style, and it's by Mary Ewing Mulligan and Ed McCarthy. This wine talks about wine in a very similar way to what I described here. So I owe this book a lot of credit for inspiring this. So I thought I would share that with you all right here at the end. So one last time.
Audrey,
Yes, hi Joan.
what about cooking with wines?
Cooking with wine, good question. So cooking with wine is something that can impart flavor to different foods. And again, much like the food that it's cooked with, it can enhance those flavors. So think about making a tomato sauce, for example, and maybe adding a little bit of that spicy red in there. It adds, adds a character to that food that wouldn't otherwise be possible. Similarly, maybe you put a little bit of white wine in your stir fry.
Interesting.
Adds a dimension to the food, even if the alcohol cooks away the heat. It still can impart some of the flavors that came from that wine.
And I did hear that if you're cooking with wine, doesn't mean you shouldn't use something that's good, that's not as good as if you were drinking it,
Right,
because it would make a difference.
It might, but what's interesting is if you cook with a wine and have enough left to drink as well.
Good idea.
So often when you cook with wine, it's not very much, so you wonder, you'll buy a whole bottle in order to.
Good point. I agree.
And it's like, wow, I have all this wine.
I just have to drink it.
Just have to drink it, right? So, but I often do that with cheese fondue, where if you are making a cheese fondue, usually with a white wine, you put some of it, of course, to make cheese. It's what the cheese will melt into, but you'll often have enough left to have as something to drink with your dish. And the flavor from what you cooked and what you're drinking, they will complement each other very nicely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Wine stored in the fridge for cooking will turn into vinegar. The fridge does not stop wine from
Oh.
going bad.
I mean, I have a part of a bottle that's been there for several years. If I open it, it's going to be.
It's
'cause I don't
vinegar.
drink, it's going to be
It's
vinegar.
vinegar.
Okay, I'm going to try that tonight. I'm going to open it up and see if you're right.
It might clean rust off of metal.
Ouch.
So be very careful.
Okay, I promise.
But yeah, nothing can really stop, wine from progressing on its inevitable journey to
Gotcha.
becoming vinegar if it's exposed to air. So you can buy little vacuum sealing things that can help keep the air out of a
Ouch.
bottle. And it does slow it down a little bit, but it doesn't stop it.
So I can use it as vinegar if it tastes that way?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I mean, yeah. So it's just, wine vinegar.
Oh,
So,
there's nothing wrong with that.
right. I mean, and it can still be used in some ways.
Yeah. Okay.
But,
Thank you.
sort of in terms of, drinking, I strongly advise against that. Or even cooking with, I mean, if you want to cook with some vinegar, maybe it'd be okay. But,
Thank you.
5 years, I don't know.
I'll have to check it out. Now you got me curious.
Yeah. So just,
I'm
be
not a
careful-
drinker. That's
be
what I'm
careful
saying.
when
That's why
pulling the top off.
yeah, I'm not a drinker. That's why it's lasting so long.
So, so I hope that answered your question.
You did. Thank you.
I see another question in the chat from Liz. The question is, what is, quote, organic, end quote, wine? So organic wine refers to typically how the grapes were grown. So in the United States, you can't call food that you're producing organic unless it meets those kinds of standards. So those grapes will be farmed in a quote unquote organic way. It may also refer a little bit to the actual winemaking process itself, but mostly refers to wine made from organic grapes, much like you would find organic lettuce or organic anything else at the grocery store. So Liz, I hope that answered your question. And I'll take a moment more if anyone has any other questions they are thinking of. Going once, going twice. Okay. So I want to thank all of you who took time. Oh, I see a question. Spoke too
Right.
soon. Okay. How do you know? This is a question from Shelley in the chat. How do you know if an unopened wine is past its prime? That is a tricky question. So wine is well known for its ability to be consumed many years after the year it was produced. And so if a bottle is not even open, it's hard to know how long that bottle can quote unquote last, provided that the seal with the cork or the screw top is intact. So Shelley, sometimes the characteristics of a wine can tell you a little bit how long it can age. So generally speaking, the more acid a wine has, the more tannin a wine has, and the more oak a wine has, the longer it can age. So this will typically mean that wines in the powerful red category or the full whites category will age longer than wines in the other categories because they will have the most characteristics that can make them long living. I'll use the Elite Bordeaux as an example. They tend to have the ability to age for many, many years in their best vintages. But just looking at a bottle, it can be very tricky to know just how long it lasts. the wine style can really help you know. Generally, most wines are meant to be consumed within a couple of years from when they were produced. But only certain wines really are designed to be, put on the shelf for a long time. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I hope I gave it my best try. It's a little bit of a specialized knowledge. Okay, glad to hear it, Shelley.
Thank you. This was great, Audrey.
You're very welcome, Susan. Glad you enjoyed. Again, we do plan to have this recording up on YouTube, thanks to Margie's magic of making that happen. And if you have any questions or thoughts, you can certainly connect with me via email here. I'll put that in the chat. If you would like to reach out to me, if you have any questions that maybe come up another time. I'm always excited to see questions in my email about things like this. And to share one of my interests along with what I do for our RSS every day. So thank you all for your wonderful feedback and being such a great audience here this afternoon. And I look forward to seeing you all, either in the center or on another Zoom.
Thank you, Audrey. I really enjoyed. I second Liz's motion.
Okay.
Do
I'm
another
glad
one.
to hear it.
Audrey.
You're welcome,
Take care.
everyone. So
Everybody have a good weekend.
likewise, you too.